Myself and my partner rented our first house back in 2012. But nothing creepy or particularly off-putting about it. Just a standard terraced house on a street of identical houses in a northern town in England. My partner, our wife, was pregnant at the time too, so we needed somewhere to bring up our first kid. We chose this one as it was in the area that we were familiar with and the rent was affordable. When we first moved in, everything was normal too. Just a standard house, and we set about getting furnishings and all the usual stuff. I used to take my wife to work early in the morning, and I'd drop her off and I would come back home. The front door opened directly into the living room, and there was a sliding door from this room which went into the kitchen. This had a door going out the back to an enclosed yard, shared with the nearby houses, and the stairs were leading upstairs. There was also a frosted glass window next to the sliding door, which was presumably once a serving hatch, but now just served to let some natural light in, as the sun never got to the front of the house due to the narrow street and surrounding houses. Now, within a few weeks of moving in, I developed a weird feeling like something was watching me through the window. It wasn't overpowering, but it did get to the point whereby I would actively avoid looking at it out of the corner of my eye, as some part of me was just always worried that I might see something on the other side looking back. I'd always been deeply skeptical of anything paranormal, so I always tried to ignore it or just laugh it off as me just being stupid in what was an unfamiliar house. That said, though, the feeling became stronger, to the point that after dropping my wife at work, I would come home and catch a few hours on the sofa in the living room, as I didn't want to go into the kitchen and up the stairs to bed. The feeling was definitely strongest though in the kitchen and on the stairs, and the only way that I can really describe it is that it felt predatory, like the constant nagging feeling that something was either watching you or right over your shoulder about to rush you, even though there was nothing there. And things seriously escalated after one particular evening. So we were watching a Darren Brown TV show whereby he was disproving the idea of the paranormal and seances. Part of the show asked you to perform on a Ouija board at home, and the premise was that he would lead the responses and tell you what results you would get, thereby removing any idea of it being anything more than just suggestions and parlor trick. And my skeptical nature, combined with my wife's belief in the paranormal, meant that I was keen to go along with this, to prove how her beliefs were just silly. Well, we started the Ouija board and went along with all the instructions, except that we didn't get the results the show said that we should. We got something far more sinister. When we asked for the name of any spirit, rather than the scripted name we were supposed to get, we got the name Ernest. By this point, I'm sort of laughing, thinking that my wife is pranking me and that Ernest is a stupid name to come up with. My wife isn't laughing, though, and says that we should stop. Thinking that it was all her, I go along with it. "Do you like us living here, Ernest?" The response was no. "Why not, Ernest? What do you think of me?" "Rogue." Now, it's worth mentioning that this confused me. My only experience of the word rogue was as various classes in video games. So I said, "Okay, what do you think of my wife?" "Whore," it responded. Wife is getting more upset, and by this point is really quite distressed. We follow the rules and say goodbye, though. The glass that we were using as a planchette goes to goodbye. The board that we were using was made out of scraps of paper with letters and numbers and the usual yes, no, hello, goodbye on them. But as my wife was so freaked out by this, I collected them together, put them in a sort of glass bowl, and took them out to the yard and burned them. Partly for her peace of mind, but I'll admit partly for my own too. So that night we had gone to bed, and maybe around 20 or so minutes after we had got into bed, we heard a loud bang that came from downstairs. I went downstairs to check everything, thinking that something may have fallen over. But everything was still in place, so I just went back to bed. As we lived in a terrace house, I told my wife that it might be the neighbors banging a cupboard door, and I eventually went to sleep. The next night we went to bed. Within the first half hour of being in bed, the exact same bang came from downstairs. This happened every night, no matter what time we went to bed too, whether it was 9 p.m. or 1 a.m. Within half an hour, we would always hear the same bang, always at least once, sometimes even twice. We tried to replicate it, and after trying everything, we discovered that a heavy cupboard door in the corner of the kitchen, when opened and then let go of, made the same exact noise. I was pretty intrigued by this and keen to find out what this was, as we'd never had any signs of pests or vermin, and the cupboard was fixed to the wall about 6 foot off the ground, so I asked my wife to let me set up a camera in the kitchen recording after we went to bed and whatnot. She wouldn't let me though, as she said that she either didn't want to know or didn't want to antagonize it if it was anything. And things really began to go downhill from here. We would find ourselves arguing over the smallest things, having full-blown shouting arguments for hours over nothing, despite normally being a very chilled-out person, often accused of being too laid back. I found myself constantly on edge in a combination of what I can only describe as anger and anxiety. This didn't happen overnight, obviously, and was something that built up slowly with both of us, to the point I didn't notice it was happening until much later. There was no waking up a different person moment or anything, but just a slow and subtle change. Despite never having had before, I began suffering nightmares on a regular basis. I would have vivid dreams of family members dying in horrific ways, such as being burned alive. I would wake up screaming or in tears, and my wife would have to spend an hour reassuring me that they weren't real and calming me down, as they just felt so real. Most disturbing, though, was she said that when she'd wake up and toss and turn due to being heavily pregnant, and I'd lay there with my eyes wide open, just staring blankly, like I was asleep but with my eyes open, and when she told me to close them, I would, with no other reaction or comment, which is creepy, right? I have absolutely no recollection of ever doing this, and have never done this at any other point before or since living in that place. But the arguments continued, and they got worse. The regular bang at night continued, and the overall sense that something was following me, particularly in the kitchen and the stairwell, became more and more overpowering, despite my best efforts to convince myself that I was being ridiculous and trying to force myself to walk slowly. But I was clearing that flight of stairs like 3 steps at a time now, filled with adrenaline and my heart pounding in my ears. Strangely though, there was a brief lull in activity in the month or so before our child was born. It was around Christmas and the arguments had abated and we seemed to get back to ourselves. And quite honestly, I thought that we had turned a corner. I mean, the nightly bang persisted, but we'd become so used to it by now that we just looked at each other and rolled our eyes. My wife told me that the kitchen or the living room window and the sense of being watched or followed was something that she was experiencing too now. Then our little boy was born and everything was okay for the first week or so. But the atmosphere soon began to change. The sense of danger or anxiety began to creep back in and we started to bicker again. The atmosphere was also made worse as our new baby would just cry constantly every hour of the day when he was in the house. He would sleep for like 20-minute intervals and the rest of the time would be spent trying to nurse, wind, feed, distract, play, anything to try and soothe him, but nothing ever seemed to work. We had him back and forth to hospitals and doctors so many times in the first few months, but inevitably when we got there, he was calm and sleeping or gurgling happily. The doctors would look at us like we were crazy, and I was beginning to think that I was cracking up myself. But when we got home, the crying would always begin again. We would take it in turns to see him at night, but this wasn't helped by the fact that I was now apparently doing the weird sleeping with the eyes open thing again. And it all culminated for me one night when I was laid in bed, waiting for the inevitable cry to start, when I saw a shadow form in the corner nearest the window and begin to slowly move across the fitted wardrobes that we had in the room. I initially thought that it was being created by the curtains against the headlights of a car moving slowly down the road, but it just wasn't moving right. The best comparison I can make is like that of ink being dropped into water. The room was dark to try and help our boy sleep, but this was much darker than the rest of the room, like a very rich black, and seemed to have shapes like smoky tendrils coming off of it. I laid and watched it as it inched along the cupboards, and then watched it go around a corner and continue on the wall. I knew at this point that it wasn't a shadow, as a shadow would have jumped from the wardrobe to the wall, but not creep around a corner that was facing in the opposite direction to the window. I watched it go out the door and then onto the stairs. Now, if this was to happen now, I would have noped straight out of that room, but at the time I remember being oddly sort of mesmerized by it, and only starting to feel any kind of fear after it left the room. I resolved not to tell my wife, as we'd already experienced enough weirdness to be on edge, and the idea that I may have just seen a manifestation would probably upset her even more. It was winter at this point though, and the house was constantly cold, not helped by how dark it was due to sunlight being unable to make its way in. No matter what we tried, we just couldn't get the place to maintain a constant comfortable temperature. One room may be red hot, but the next to the point of freezing, despite the heating being set to the same throughout the house. The rooms which experienced hot or cold varied from hour to hour as well. The temperature would spike in a room only to fall again to uncomfortably cold in the space of half an hour. We had a room thermometer for our baby, and we were having to constantly move from room to room to try and find one that was relatively normal. Unfortunately, I found the one place in the house where the temperature remained the most stable were the stairs and that landing. So I would always find myself having to sit there fighting the rising anxiety to run, because it was the one room where our child could either not be overheating or wrapped in blankets against the cold. It was around this time too that I remember a dream quite clearly where I was talking with a woman, no idea who she was, and saying how dark and cold the house was. She asked me if I knew what that meant, and I said no. I remember even now when she said that life needs light to grow. The only thing that can thrive in darkness is death. And I'll admit that it may have been my overactive paranoia or subconscious, but I clearly remember waking up with these words still in my head. Now, when I hear a lot of these stories, I often wonder why people didn't just get out of there. There's usually excuses about not wanting to surrender their home and fighting for their house, and, well, this wasn't our house that we were renting, and all the combined problems and the weirdness just got too much. And so we decided that we just had to move. We found a house a few miles away, and we gave our notice on the place, and it was the night before we were due to move, and in the early hours of the morning that we heard a piercing siren. We had a carbon monoxide alarm, and it was going off. We opened all the doors and the windows and got outside. My wife and our boy went to my parents while I waited for the gas engineer. He arrived and immediately condemned the gas fire that we had in the living room, which had started leaking carbon monoxide. And it's difficult not to think that without that alarm, we could have all easily been dead. And the fact that it happened on the day that we were due to leave, I don't know. I just couldn't shake the idea that the two were linked, and something either wanted us not to leave or to give us a parting gift. And if you've got this far, then well done. It's pretty long, I know, and I'd like to say that we moved and everything was better overnight, but it wasn't. The new house started out okay, but the nagging feeling of being followed around slowly crept back. Not as intense as before, but definitely noticeably there. In this house, we all shared a bedroom and had a lot of stuff still packed in boxes and generally cluttered in a spare room. One of them was a bouncer for our baby. It was a Fisher & Price frog-type bouncer and had eyes on the front which, when rolled, would play a tune. And around 4 a.m. one morning, the frog tune just starts going off. I immediately looked to the crib next to our bed, thinking that our baby might have got out somehow and started playing with it, but he was fast asleep. I did everything that I could to get it to go off again without spinning the eyes, knocking or hitting the floor around it. I tried to tell myself that it was maybe the batteries, but this was the only time that it ever happened, and we didn't have to change the batteries for like the next 2 years or so that we had it. After this too, the feeling of being watched grew, only now it was strongest from a conservatory on the back of the property. My wife and I had been through enough by this point that we now openly discussed the weird feelings with each other. There were a set of double doors between the kitchen and the conservatory, and this one particular night, my wife asked that I close them. I didn't ask why, but did so, and about an hour or so later I decided to go back for a cigarette. As I opened the doors, the glass-panelled French doors of the conservatory were in front of me. It was dark outside, so all I could see in the doors were the reflections of the lit kitchen behind me. As I walked towards the doors, I see in the reflection, very clearly, a black silhouette of a person run behind me, almost like it ran into the house through the exterior wall and straight through to the understairs. My first thought was that it was someone outside, but as I checked, no one was there. I stood there smoking and thinking, and I realized that it couldn't have been outside, as the figure passed behind and was briefly obscured by my own reflection, so it had to have been in the room behind me. I quickly finished my cigarette and I went back inside. I sat there mulling it over before telling my wife the next day, to which she said that she had wanted the door shut as she hadn't felt comfortable about that room all day, more so than usual. We had a similar instance a month or so later, which could have ended badly too. Whilst driving and pulling onto the motorway, interstate for my American friends, a slip road, my wife all of a sudden jumped onto the brakes. When I asked what the heck she was doing, she said that a dark figure had just run in front of the car. There was literally no one around us at the slip road though, and it was in a wooded area away from any built-up spots or paths. I didn't see it myself, as I was in the back of the car with our boy, but my mother-in-law was in the front, and she said that she saw it too, and was equally spooked. Gradually, since then, the feelings of anxiety and tension subsided though, thankfully, and we eventually moved again. Mirroring our experience of leaving the last place though, on the day that we were moving, we were taking our belongings down to the drive to a van when a roof tile slid off and narrowly missed hitting me or my brother-in-law, who was helping us. Thankfully, though, we moved to a house which, out of any, should have been the most haunted, having been built earlier than the others in like the 1830s. This house, however, was the most tranquil and had no such weird atmospheres or happenings or any of that stuff. All of this was around like 6 to 8 years ago now, and we often walk past the first house and have seen it come up for rent many times since then, so nobody seems to stay there long. But the funny thing is that we've both said a few times how when we see it on the market, we both have a desire to go back. We even talked about going for a fake viewing just to walk around the place. We never have, but even the idea that after everything we still feel an urge to go back to it is something which the rational part of my brain just can't really explain. I'm really tempted to go back through all of the old census records too to see if an Ernest ever lived in that house, but so far I've resisted the temptation to rake it all over for fear of setting something off again. That and me finding out that someone did, well, I really don't know if I would like that answer. Anyway, thanks for taking the time to get through all of this and listen to me. It's nice to get it off my chest, and I would love to hear from you guys if you've had anything similar, or if anyone can offer any explanation as to what all of this might have been. So I was told this story about myself on a long motorway journey back from a football match with my dad back in 2011. I'm 27 now, and I live in the East Midlands, UK. Shortly after I turned 18 in 2011, my dad told me this story about me from back when I was 6, and I've always found it disturbing ever since. So apparently, this happened in 1999. My dad was a devoted member of the church at the time with 2 young children, me, 6, and my sister, 3. And after we'd had our dinner one evening, 2 men knocked on our door and tried to talk to my dad about their beliefs. I have no idea what they were or what they stood for, but after several minutes of getting nowhere with my dad, they ended up giving him a little booklet about their views or something. My dad felt uneasy about it and has since said that he bitterly regrets it, but he took the booklet, despite feeling that it had brought a somewhat sinister energy into our room. He then went on about his evening entertaining his 2 young kids, and eventually he put us to bed. Later on into the night, though, when it was time for him and my mum to go to bed, he went into our respective bedrooms and prayed for us, like he did every night. Just the usual good health, happiness prayer any Christian father does for his kids. With my 3-year-old sister, everything was fine and nothing was wrong. However, when he went into my room to do the same, something very odd happened. So he did his usual prayer for health and happiness, with me totally conked out asleep. But then I did something that he's never been able to explain. As soon as he said Amen, apparently I bolted upright at like 90 degrees, opened my eyes fully with my face looking at the ceiling, and let out a shrieking animalistic growl lasting just a couple of seconds, at such a low pitch that no grown man could even replicate it. He said that there was no colour in my eyes at all, just pure black, and after that I flopped straight back down to sleep and apparently could not be woken up, even after several attempts to jolt me awake. I'm careful who I tell this story to, especially my ex-partners who have shared a bed with me over the years, but it always makes me feel terribly uneasy. I've had many other strange experiences in my life which I can't explain, and sometimes wonder if it's all linked to what happened that night, but I wouldn't say my dad is a humorless man, but he's a serious person and not much of a storyteller. I know for a fact that he'd only share this with me if it were totally accurate, especially as he waited until I was an adult to even tell me. So today I went for a run, like I always do, and I typically go around 7:50 to 8 o'clock, and I come back home at around 8:40 to 9 o'clock. Anyways, I run around my neighborhood, and there's always this part of the neighborhood that is always super dark. As I got close to that dark area, I turn on my flashlight, and for some reason I look across the street and I see a figure just sitting down in front of a house. I thought to myself that it could have been a Halloween decoration because the way it was sitting was just super stiff. I shine my light at the thing and I saw that it had no face, and I turned on the strobe setting of my flashlight hoping for a reaction, but nothing happened. This made me think that it was a prop because it just didn't move, so I just continued my run. I always do 2 laps, and on my second, I arrived back at the dark place and saw that there was nothing there. And this made me really creeped out because that thing just didn't move a muscle when I shined the strobe at it. Anyways, I'm gonna run again tomorrow, and if I see it again, I'll try to snap a photo and I'll update you guys. So my husband, 36, and I, 28, live in a 100-year-old house that we've had some weird experiences in before. We just moved into the carriage house, but a year and a half ago we lived in the main house when this happened. So I had just gotten out of the shower and was lotioning and such when I looked out the door and saw my naked husband walk past me and into the bathroom. So I asked him to grab me something, and then I heard him talking in the living room. So I wrapped a towel around me and ran into the living room to tell at him for pulling a prank on me like that. He then looked at me surprised because I had apparently been talking to him for the last few minutes standing behind him. It took me a few more days to actually believe that this wasn't a prank, but it really freaked me out to my core. We had this brick that lights up, and only when you touch it, sitting on top of a shelf in the living room. It routinely lit itself up when no one was touching it, and sometimes we even heard voices and people walking at different times. And some nights, in the middle of the night, a radio would just start playing music. It sounded like it came from the living room, but we didn't even have a radio, so what the hell was that noise? When I was 17, I joined a men's fitness group to help me get ready for the soccer season. The group was cool, but I was the youngest there. All the other men were much older, between the ages of 25 and 50. Most had families and jobs, and it was kind of uncomfortable at first, but eventually I saw a lot of them as mentors in my life, and they saw me as someone to be mentored. However, there was this one guy who just took it a little too far. I don't really recall his name, but I think it was Steve. Steve was around 45 and single, which was strange because all of the men were married except for the 25-year-old and me. Every time we worked out, he would gravitate towards me, ask me questions about my life that were really normal, I suppose, and we sort of were friends after a week or two. But he was just a really strange dude. He would say off-the-wall things all the time, and he spoke his mind, but most of the time they were just really mean things. I don't really remember exactly what he said because it was a while ago now, but he really started to creep me out, and he started asking me to hang out with him alone a lot, and he asked for my number because we were going to a race the next week, so I gave it to him, but then he just wouldn't stop calling and texting me. And when I wouldn't reply, he would get mad at me and say things like, I thought that we were friends. Again, this man is 30 years older than me, and I'm 17. The one thing that I do remember vividly, though, is that I was at my sister's house babysitting for her, and the guy called me like 5 times at 9 o'clock on a school night. I eventually picked up and talked to him for a bit, and when I said that I couldn't go where he was, he asked for my sister's address and said that he was somehow in the neighborhood. This scared me because he was from another town completely, and I never mentioned where my sister lives, but he was apparently on the adjacent road now. I just told him no, and then I hung up. I didn't go back to the group for a while because I thought the guy was stalking me, or at least it seemed like it a lot. After a month, I went back to the group, and the guy had gone to a different town. I saw him again a few years later, and he ignored me at first, but then introduced himself like we had never met, which was really weird. When I was 13, I was at my grandmother's house in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I had brought along 2 friends, and we'll call them W and K. That area has always been strange. It's located in miles of forest with a ton of deserted buildings and houses on a dead-end road, leading from an old 1830s cemetery as well. It was around fall, and I'd just gotten back from the old swimming hole with my friends where we would catch goldfish and find salamanders, although Kay was scared of them. It was already getting pretty late, and we extended the night by spending time with my grandparents around a campfire until around midnight. It really was a great night, though. I was able to roast a marshmallow to a golden brown perfection, and I've never had the patience to do so afterwards, but eventually, Grandma started to yawn, and my parents headed off to bed, so my friend and I made our way to where we were planning to sleep, an old camper out by the horse barn beyond the house on the edge of the woods. Now, the camper was crusty as hell. It was clear that nobody ever used it. There was mouse crap just littered through the shower floor in the bathroom, and a light rain began to fall, and it started leaking through the vents above before we could even close them. Luckily, it was a short and gentle rain, and we all began to drift off to sleep at around 1 a.m. But that was when I heard it, the pittering of feet where I was sleeping. I was in the pull-out bed that usually would come out over the bed of the truck, and my 2 friends were at the other end of the camper, near the dining table, which converted into 2 twin-size beds. Now, for a 13-year-old boy, I was admittedly not a fan of mice. Maybe it's stupid, but at the time they just really freaked me out. I asked my friends if I could go lay down in the twins with them, and they protested, especially W, who was almost asleep, but finally allowed me to slip between them to escape this small mouse, but more strange danger came later on. So once again, we're almost asleep, our eyes are heavy with exhaustion at around midnight. But then, my grandmother's horses in the nearby barn just began to go crazy, running and slamming into their doors, screaming. We were already a bit scared by this, but it got way worse. Because from outside, we hear this just strange noise. It sounded like a grunt, almost bearish, which would make sense that it would be a bear, since that was the season where the black bears are active. But I'm 99% sure that this just wasn't a bear. A sensation of frozen fear washed over me. We whispered amongst ourselves, debating what to do next. We were just three scared little kids packed in like sardines, all alone in a camper, and I tried to text my mum from my old iPhone 4, but we didn't have service. And to make things worse, we were completely stranded. We all sat still and began to hold our breath. I mean, it was just a grunt, and surely whatever it was gone now, right? Probably just a bear passing through. But no, we then felt the footsteps thump towards the locked door, and then the door jiggled. I prayed, and we all prayed, that the door just wouldn't come unlocked. Our little baby minds were going absolutely crazy. All three of us were crying because we didn't know what the hell was outside. And then it got worse. There was sniffing at all the windows. This creature began to circle us, and the sniffing elevated to rhythmic tapping on the glass panes, which certainly wasn't dripping water because the water was not hitting the side of the trailer. But then, for about 15 minutes, there was nothing. Whatever it was gave us a moment of downtime before grunting again and circling once again, tapping on the windows. All of us were petrified in our beds, never looking outside. It shook the camper too near the door at one stage, and we were just terrified. The camper rocking lightly on its wheels, the suspension nicely swaying us back and forth. And then, that was it. We waited for hours, just waiting for it to come back, but it had stayed and circled us for around 3 to 4 hours, tapping and grunting, going away and coming back, because I honestly think that it wanted us. In the morning, we all dared each other to see who would be out first at the door. I took the fall, trying to prove that I was definitely not afraid of strange creatures or mice. And when I stepped outside, I found a singular deep claw mark across the door that definitely was not there before. We booked it back to the house, and we convinced my mum to let us leave that day, and I got my grandparents to confirm that the claw mark was definitely not there before. I even let the dog sniff around nearby, but it was a dead end, and the horses were okay too, despite their insane behavior for 3 hours the night before. And so, we just packed up and we left. 6 hours later, I'm home and my friends are at their homes. I crash out immediately because I got no sleep. And then when I wake up, I have a missed call from my grandmother. She left a message and she said that in front of the camper door, she had found a mutilated raccoon. It wasn't eaten, but was absolutely ripped to shreds. Usually, a predator will hide or store the prey and keep it together, but this was really odd. Now, Michigan has a bit of a reputation for a big Wendigo population. I have a few friends who have had encounters themselves, allegedly. Also, this was formerly Native American land where we were camping. Take that how you will, but we had permission from the local Native Americans since my grandmother had joined them, and she was very knowledgeable about these things. I never brought the Wendigo thing up to her, though, because I'm pretty scared that it'll terrify her as well. When I'm with her, though, we always lock the windows and the doors these days, because there's definitely something strange out there, and it wasn't the only strange thing that I've seen on that land since being there. The afterlife, spirits, and the paranormal have always intrigued me. My husband and I love to watch basically anything paranormal related, and like anyone too who watches these types of shows, I did begin to wonder what was real and what's staged. We always talked about wanting to go on some sort of a ghost hunt, but as for my husband, he's always been a bit of a skeptic. He's one of those I need to see it to believe it kind of people. So, for my husband's birthday in July, I bought us 2 tickets to a public investigation at a place called Hillview Manor, located in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. It's a place known for its paranormal activity. The tickets that I bought included a tour of the building, and then after the tour, you are able to go off on your own to investigate as well. The time slot for this investigation is from 7 p.m. until 4 a.m. If you would like to read about the history on this place more, then you can also find them online at Haunted Hill View. Now, everyone thought that we were crazy for wanting to do this, especially overnight for 9 hours. But it's just something that we've always been interested in experiencing on our own. So we arrived at 6:30, and there were maybe 3 other small groups there to investigate as well. One of these groups takes this kind of thing very seriously and brought a ton of equipment. Here we were with our little backpack that had a few flashlights, a voice recorder, snacks, drinks, and extra batteries. We walked into the building nonetheless, and it just felt creepy right from the beginning. Maybe because we knew it was haunted, or because it just smelled musty and old from being unused for so many years. The building has no electricity, other than a few lights in the bathroom and the exit signs lighting the hallways. It's structural code for being able to have investigators and visitors in the building. But after all the investigators arrive, the people who work there give us a tour and backstory of the Hillview Manor and its most active rooms. This building has 3 floors, really long hallways, and many, many rooms, as it was once used as a home for the elderly, poor, and the crazy. Not only were there suicides and murders here too, but also many other stories of the residents and activity throughout the property. During the tour, though, my husband realized that he did not care for the 3rd floor. He didn't really have a reason for it, he just didn't like the way it made him feel. With him being a skeptic, I found this quite amusing, if I'm being honest. And I didn't witness anything out of the ordinary while we walked around with the tour guides. I asked my husband if he saw or felt anything, and he said that he would tell me after the tour. After we were finished with the walkthrough of the building, my husband pulled me aside and said that during the tour, he just kept feeling like something was touching him on his arm. It happened once in one of the rooms and again in the chapel, and he said it almost felt like cobwebs rubbing his arm, but every time he went to grab it to pull it away, there was nothing there. This creeped him out a bit, obviously, but after everyone regrouped in the front room, we were able to start investigating on our own. Now, we have never done anything like this before, so we just kind of walked off, just the 2 of us with a voice recorder, flashlights, and EMP in hand, acting like we knew what we were doing. We walked the halls and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, the floor my husband really did not want to go back to, but I figured that we should just start there and get it over with while it was still light out. We didn't last long up there though, because, like I said, my husband just did not care for it. After leaving the 3rd floor, we visited other rooms in other portions of the building and tried to record a few sessions. We never experienced anything the entire time, and I did a lot of talking. I was always respectful and just tried to say hello and talk with whatever may have wanted to communicate back. My husband didn't talk much, and he finally admitted that he was kind of scared, which was amusing. As it started to get late though, we began to realize just how dark this building really was. It was kind of freaky, and we usually aren't afraid of the dark, but when you're thrown into a setting that is supposed to have spirits and paranormal activity, you tend to panic a little bit. But to shorten this up, I'm going to fast forward through a little bit. Keep in mind though that during this time, we haven't experienced anything. So after we realized that we were too chicken to keep investigating on our own, we decided to find somebody else to tag along with. We found another group of 2 to team up with, and I mean, who doesn't feel safer in a group, right? This other team has done some paranormal investigations before, with this being their 6th one. And so we stuck together throughout the rest of the night, investigating mainly the 1st and the 2nd floors. Around 11 PM, we end up in the atrium on the 1st floor. This is where the residents would hang out, play the organ, checkers, or watch TV. We held up an EVP session for a while in there and decided to move on since we weren't getting much. At this point, I was getting kind of bored because I haven't seen, heard, or felt one damn thing all night. We walked out of the atrium and down the hallway. They call this area 1 North. From what I've read, and I'm not sure just how true this statement is, but it was the combative unit. During the tour, one of the guides admitted that she did not like this hallway, and the end of the hallway furthest away from the atrium especially. She said that she just gets a bad feeling there. It's a hallway with patient rooms and a nurse's station, and we stopped at the nurse's station to record for a little bit, but again, nothing. So we moved a little further down the hall past the station. We stayed in this area for a good 15 minutes or so, with not much going on other than hearing slight shuffling at the end of the hallway towards the atrium. We laughed about it and said, of course now we're hearing stuff in the area that we just came from. and at this point, we turned off all the devices and got ready to move on. Mike, one of the others that we had met up with, needed to charge his cell phone, so he knelt down to pull a portable charger out of his bag. And here is where things got real. So after no activity all night, I literally cannot believe what is about to happen to us. It is 11:30 p.m. now, and my husband and I are standing on the left side of the hall with Mike and Jenny on the right side. Think of it like a hospital hallway, kind of. And while waiting for Mike to finish plugging his phone into his portable charger, we all begin hearing heavy footsteps starting near the nurse's station. These footsteps grew louder, heavier, and closer as this thing started running towards us. But not only that, the walls and the floor shook with every footstep that this thing took. It ran so fast and so hard down this hallway at us that before we knew it, it was between and through all of us. And just an immediate rush of electricity, is the only way I can describe it, ran through my entire body. Screams of absolute fear escaped each and every one of us, and I've never heard my husband scream that way that he did that night. He's a tough guy, so to hear him get startled by anything was just crazy to me. I was backed into the wall of the hallway, my husband tripped over his feet and fell backwards, Jenny fell into the room behind her, and Mike stayed crouched down where he was still trying to plug in his phone. It all just happened so fast, but it was so real and so scary. It was at this stage too that my husband started yelling, "Okay, we're leaving, enough." We immediately ran to the office, which thankfully was not very far away. We walked through the office doors and I just completely lost it. I fell to my knees bawling and shaking, and I was wearing my Apple Watch at the time and received a notification that my heart rate was way too high. I later checked this to see what the alert was for, and in just 2 minutes, my heart rate jumped from 120 to 180 plus BPM. I knew that they had surveillance cameras, and I told them that they needed to rewind the footage right now and show me what the hell that was. Unfortunately, we saw nothing at all on this video. All 4 of us experienced the same damn thing, but how there was nothing visible on the video, I'll never know. It figures, though, that we all turned our devices off since we were getting ready to move on. How would anyone believe us without audio proof, right? If we heard it and felt it, the audio devices surely would have picked it up too. But it was just so forceful, almost like a train rushing between all of us. Whatever it was, I didn't get a good feeling from it. It elicited just so much fear from me. I don't know if it was because I was so scared from this thing running at us so quickly and unexpectedly in the dark, or maybe because it really was just a bad thing. After viewing the video and trying to calm myself down the best that I could though, I wanted to get away from this place pretty much ASAP. After my husband and I told the spirits that they did not have permission to come home with us, we left. 4 hours before our scheduled time, in fact. It was an 1.5-hour drive home. My adrenaline was so bad that I could hardly breathe. Luckily, my husband was well enough to drive and we got home, and of course I just couldn't sleep. I was terrified and I just couldn't be in the dark at that stage, and I was sick to my stomach to the point that I was heaving over the toilet all night. I couldn't eat or drink, and I was gagging on everything that I tried to put into my mouth to eat. The next night, I had a friend bring me some sage so that I could cleanse my house and myself too, and my mind was just all over the place because my biggest fear was that something may have followed me home. Everyone assured me that if something was attached to me, my kids and dogs would know. I ended up not eating for 4 days and not sleeping. I felt sick to my stomach and depressed, and I lost about 10 pounds in 4 days. I was scared to be alone, and I begged my husband to stay home from work. My dogs would run down the hallway in our house, and I would have some form of a PTSD episode or something, because them running would remind me of the feeling of that spirit charging down the hallway through us. The feeling the footsteps in the walls and the floor, and loud noises startled me too. I didn't want to be around my kids, my husband, or anybody. I just wanted to kind of be left alone, but with people around, if that makes sense. My anxiety was so bad that I was willing to do anything to help me feel better. I even had people bringing me Valium, which I ended up not using per my husband's requests, and essential oils as well. Crystals in the water, and I even thought about having the house blessed. I just didn't want to go on in life knowing what I knew now because it scared the absolute crap out of me. I honestly wish that I never found out just how real the paranormal really was. I wanted to go back to how I was before having this experience. I cried every day wishing that I could just feel like myself again, and I began to wonder about what really happens after you die. If spirits were real, and who's to say that heaven, hell, God and the devil, aliens and UFOs for that matter, weren't real too. I would lay in bed wide awake all night, freaking myself out while listening to every creak of my settling home, mad at my husband for being able to sleep so soundly while I was unable to sleep until I felt safe enough after the sun came up. I did a lot of reading on the internet after this incident, and I figured out that what I was suffering from was severe panic and anxiety due to trauma. Some people experience trauma after a car accident, a natural disaster, an intruder, but this was my trauma. A paranormal experience. Sounds crazy, right? I know, but would I have ever been able to go and talk to someone if I needed to? Without sounding nuts, that is. Fast forward 3 months, though, and here I am. Almost normal again. Still afraid of the dark, I won't lie. I begin to panic if I'm left in a dark room for too long while I'm searching for a light switch. Like I'm going to see or feel something or someone until I get the lights on. I'm finally, and thankfully, sleeping through the night. It took me a while to get where I am, but I'm very thankful that I'm healing with every day that passes. After this experience, too, I totally respect the spirit world even more than I did before, and I'll never barge into their space again like that. To this day, I still can't believe how bad the experience messed me up and how sick it made me afterwards as well. I'm forever going to wonder why this spirit chose our group that night. Why was I the only one that felt the way that I did after this experience, and who was it, and what was their purpose? The people who worked there were really intrigued as well, saying nothing like that has ever happened in the many times people have visited and investigated there. And I would be curious to find out if it ever happened again. So this event took place on a local hiking trail that I wasn't too fond of. I won't name the trail itself for privacy reasons, but I will say that it's here in Southern Cali. I went with 2 friends, and for the sake of their privacy too, their names for this story will be Jaslyn and Vivian. So this trail is a 40-minute drive away from our hometown, and this was unplanned like most of our hikes were and destinations too. We arrived approximately at 6 p.m, and we were all aware that the time that we finish up the trail it was going to be dark. But we start walking, and we've been walking for about 20 minutes, and this guy with a pretty large stick passes by and tells us to be very careful because of the snakes being present. Just by the look on his face, it looked like he was pretty petrified too. Now, I normally run into rattlesnakes on hikes, and yes, they tend to look a bit scary, but just give them their space and they'll leave you alone. I didn't acknowledge much of what he said, but he hands me the stick that he was holding, and I give it to Jaslyn. Normally I would have just thrown it away, but for some reason I told Jaslyn just to keep it. The whole situation was a little bit weird for me, and telling her was also weird to hold onto the stick like that, but I just ignored the weird thoughts, and we just kept going. After walking for an additional 10 minutes, we run into this couple, and normally we greet people on the way up and down the hill. And the couple asked us if we had flashlights, and we replied with yes. That's when I asked them too how far away we were from the springs, and the man said that it's about another 25 minutes away. We part ways from them and proceed to walk. At this point, the sun is finally set, and it's beginning to get dark. Jaslyn bought her taser, a light, and hairspray. Vivian brought her flashlight, and we had a pretty decent view thanks to the light provided. But this is when things begin to go south. We're literally only 5 minutes away from reaching the springs, and as soon as we step 1 foot closer, an adult rattlesnake almost falls onto Jaslyn's head. It slithers away pretty fast, but strangely enough, the entire environment just started to feel ominous all of a sudden. Jaslyn and Vivi were also feeling the same way. I am usually the friend who perennially likes to brush off any thought of fear or negativity. I just don't like to automatically jump to conclusions. But now, I was feeling weird, I must admit. Jaslyn, on the other hand, gets a little frightened when anything scary happens. And yes, that includes running into animals like snakes. As far as I know, Vivi hasn't really experienced anything terrifying, or just an event in particular that makes one genuinely feel fear, that is. But given the situation and the ominous feeling and it being completely dark by now, we decide that it's probably best to just head back. To give a better idea too on how steep it was going downhill, it was dangerous to the point where one wrong step can make you fall off the cliff or slip and get badly injured. Even trying to run during the day is a really big risk. The paths were really narrow and we had to walk behind each other. But fast forward 10 minutes since we've been walking and we reach one part of the trail that is the steepest. Naturally, I'm used to power walking fast, going along with the flow. Vivi was pacing herself, going a little slower, and Jaslyn stayed in the middle. I start moving the taser's mini flashlight and all of a sudden see a blurry figure standing in the corner of the trail. I begin to slow down, but I wasn't going too fast to begin with. I had stopped right in front of it, and this is when I noticed that Jaslyn and Vivi were left a little bit behind. I moved the flashlight up towards the figure's face, and it revealed this putrid-looking guy. It looked like he hadn't showered in months, and man, did it scare the heck out of me. I greeted the man in sarcasm, hoping to get a bit of feedback from this guy, but nothing. No response whatsoever. He just stares at me with this deranged blank expression. At the time, he really made me feel unsettled. He looked high on something for sure, and I know for a fact that it wasn't weed. Jaslyn and Vivi get closer, and that's when I hear Vivi jokingly say, "I'm surprised you didn't tase him." Even after hearing that, still no response from this guy though. This is when I began to look at him from head to toe, just to see if he has a weapon of some sort. The entire time he had one hand in his pants and the other outside. But this is when I finally noticed that he was wearing black gloves. To give a description on how the man looked too, he had really long greasy hair, really dirty pants with bleach stains all over it, I think, a big oversized hoodie and a ripped beanie, and to top it all off, he also didn't have a flashlight. It was at least 8:30 p.m. now, and there was just no way that he could see and walk around the dark with no light like that, especially since his trail is almost impossible to walk around at night, and obviously every single red flag possible started going off in my head. My unsettling feeling starts to rise, and I'm pretty sure at this point, the man can see the fear all over my face. This is also when Jaslyn tells me in Spanish that she's more afraid of this guy than the snakes. I told her to stay quiet and turn off the music. She'd had music playing softly the whole time back. But this is exactly the point when Jaslyn and I began to run. I didn't really notice that Vivi was left behind too, but I just kept running. I was too scared to process the eerie encounter. Vivi gets a little freaked out, and Jaslyn and I had to calm her down. I started to lose a little bit of patience when she wanted to stop and stand for a few minutes, but she was just in complete denial and refused to believe that this guy was much of a threat. I couldn't bear standing around too, so I began to walk quickly. Luckily, Jaslyn managed to convince Vivi to move forward too, but the rest of the hike, luckily for us, was okay, besides the occasional slipping and tripping. And once we got back to the car, we pretty much all said it. That guy, he definitely gave off those serial killer vibes, if that's a thing. Anyway, after that incident, I pretty much promised to myself that I would never, ever return there at night, ever again. I always wonder how close I was to getting murdered that day. My ex-boyfriend and I used to be co-workers. Yeah, I know. And every day after work, we'd go to this empty parking lot 15 minutes away from work to have a smoke before he dropped me home. Well, we were pretty young, so we didn't really have a lot of other places to hang out. We were standing outside and leaning on the driver's side of the car. It was pretty dark out, and the plaza light sort of faded away, so you couldn't see beyond a certain point. We started to get lost in our conversation and weren't paying attention to our surroundings. We came here every day, and nothing unusual happened in the past. But as we're talking, we notice a guy coming out of the dark, and he was walking or jogging pretty fast. But before we had a chance to react, he was already pretty close to us, and he was dressed in oversized clothes and had a backpack. I'll call him X. So, everyone was silent at first. My ex and I were pretty much frozen and were already thinking of a plan to escape in case anything happened. We didn't want to make any sudden movements, but my ex secretly slipped me the keys to his car, assuming that he wanted me to casually walk to the passenger side and get in the driver's seat so that we could leave ASAP. As soon as I tried to move, though, X said, "Please stay where you are." He seemed emotional. He seemed kind of frantic, and he was a mix between anxious, impulsive, and kind of confident. He asked, "Can I borrow one of your phones?" My ex and I both said that we don't have our phones. I said that I hadn't paid my bill, so mine isn't functional. He said, while almost tearing up, "You expect me to believe both of you don't have a phone? This is the type of crap I'm talking about. I hate being lied to." Then he really started breaking down. He said, "I just did the most fucked up thing. You don't know what I've just been through." We honestly thought that he was on drugs or something, but he started crying and he's like, "I just had to kill my own best friend, my brother." Then he said, "I'm going to ask again, do you have a phone?" I said that I had a phone, but it's not working, which was the truth because I paid my bill late. He was like, "Don't make me do this, and I really don't want to." Then he reaches for his backpack. That's when both me and my ex realized that this might be our last day on Earth. But X said one thing that sparked something in my ex, and he said, "I'm a fucked up person. God's never going to forgive me." My ex wasn't religious, but he came from a Catholic family. He started talking, trying to calm this guy down. It was almost like a hostage negotiation or something. And my ex was like, "Remember God, man. You can always repent and be forgiven. God will forgive you." And this guy just started crying and dropped to his knees and dropped his bag. I took this chance to run to the passenger side, get in the driver's seat, reverse, and flung the passenger door open for my ex. And we just drove off as fast as we could. On the way home, we were obviously shaken, kind of in disbelief. I called the police and explained the situation. The police caught up to us and asked us for his description. And they said that they just received a call about someone with a similar description, but didn't tell us the reason. To this day, I'm really not sure if he was actually telling the truth, or if he was on drugs, or what was in his bag. My life definitely flashed for a moment, but we searched the news every day for a month for a similar incident, and we didn't find one about a man shot and injured in that area on the exact same date as the incident. So we can never really be sure, I suppose, and I guess I never really want to find out anyway. So this story takes place during the summer when I was 15. It's a true story about a small encounter that I had. So, I was living with my dad and my stepmother at the time. I remember my stepmother throwing a royal fit about buying me new school clothes because I had let a few pairs of pants get holes in them and still wore them. It was my first year of going into high school, and I wasn't about to let her spoil that for me, so I went to stay with my grandparents for the summer to earn some money. They live in a remote, small area that was once home to Native American tribes. It's very secluded despite being a mile or so from the highway, and it's all lush, gorgeous forest. My grandpa had built his own 3-story house there too, and a shop as well where he cut and assembled cedar into roofing products. And that was where I came in, hauling heavy chunks of cedar to his van, stacking, nailing, cinching up shaken shingle into bundles to be sold, and I made good money while there and was able to buy pretty much an entire new wardrobe, in fact. But as summer was coming to an end and it was just too hot to work, I decided to take a walk one day. Now, let me say that I spent my childhood roaming these woods, armed with my grandparents' 2 dogs, and we ran and played and napped all day, and I had never seen anything out of the ordinary, or gotten any sort of weird vibes. But I waited until it was a bit cooler in the evening and I started out, walking a little path that would take me to an old unused logging road. And I had tread this same path so many times that I wasn't even paying attention until I just all of a sudden felt like I was being watched. I would like to note here too that I was young at the time. I had yet to touch any drugs or alcohol, and I had no history of hallucination or mental illness, or anything along those lines. But what I saw, it still haunts me to this day. Because there he was, standing naked in the middle of my path, looking down at me with a blank expression. He was tall, maybe 7 feet, much taller than my 5'0" nothing. He had long, matted black and grey hair, and there were tufts of it growing from the sides of his arms and legs as well. There were no genitals, only smooth flesh where they should be, and his skin, it was such a sickly pale yellow and looked to be just too big for stature and hung in some spots. He made eye contact, and his yellow orbs felt like they were staring right into my soul. I couldn't move or think, and everything had gone silent around me. And the next 10 or so seconds of my life just seemed to really stretch out. But we just stood there, looking at one another before he swiftly turned and just walked back into the trees. But the foliage went undisturbed as he kind of melted through it and disappeared. I honestly expected him to charge at me, or at least be intimidating, but he just turned and left. And I haven't seen him since either, nor am I too enthusiastic to go out looking, that's for sure. I remember telling my grandma about it, but she told me that it was probably just some drug addict, as the area that she lives in has a very high number of users and manufacturers of methamphetamines. I've told this story in a thread somewhere before, but I've never really gone out of my way to share it, particularly because I know it sounds a bit made up. I've tried looking into Native American folklore, especially the local stuff, but I haven't found anything matching that description. If you actually listen to this all the way through, though, thank you. I appreciate the thought that somebody else out there knows about it now. And if you have any ideas about what this particular thing might have been, please let me know, because I would love to hear your thoughts. So one winter night, I'm in bed watching TV with the remote and my cell phone in my hands. I was in the living room, my grandfather sleeping on the bed next to the sofa, other family members sleeping upstairs. It was quiet. I felt tired, so I turned off the TV, exchanged a few texts with friends, locked my phone, and I snoozed off on the couch. It was about 3:30 a.m., I think, and my phone notified me that I'd just received a message. I unlocked my phone, started reading the message. Behind the view of my phone screen, I could see something moving. At first, I thought that there were car lights, and continued reading, but there were no cars passing by outside my house at that time. I turned my phone away, and I saw a huge cloud, like a mass in front of the closed white door, in the air, very dark, and it was kind of sparkling. It was big, thick, but not translucent, and it was moving like liquid. I locked my eyes to it, and it started moving to the left and towards me. I panicked and yelled out as loud as I could, grabbed the remote and turned the TV on. And as soon as I hit the buttons on the remote, it just vanished. I called to my mum to come and get me since I was petrified and I couldn't stop crying. I woke everybody up and obviously nobody believed me. To this day, I've found that the event had been so traumatic that I remember it as clearly as if it happened yesterday. But if you have any idea of what this could have been, if you've experienced something similar, please don't ignore this request and please share your story with me or your advice, because I would love to know what the heck that was. I work at a coffee shop, and I'm usually always the only person on shift, which means opening and closing by myself pretty much every day. Even though I'm in Baltimore, I was pretty aloof and not too worried about anything happening. But the other day, I had 2 guys that live across the street from my job come in and tell me that over the past 2 weeks, there's been an older man with a truck sitting and watching me on at least 5 separate occasions. He never stays less than an hour, just sits and watches. They weren't sure who he was actually watching at first, but one day when he was out there, I had to walk to the store, and it was very obvious that I was the one that he was watching. It kind of freaked me out about how oblivious I was, but then the other night, as the last customer left, there was a man standing in front of the store waiting for them to leave. He fit the description that the men gave me, so I was a bit wary. He tried to get in once he saw that they were gone and I was alone. So I thought fast and I clicked the doors and said that they were closed. He became visibly frustrated and started asking if he could talk to me, that he couldn't hear me through the glass. And he had just a creepy, almost excited look on his face, kind of like a dog about to get fed. I told him no, that I had to close and he needed to go. He started to knock on the glass harder and harder, and I told him that I was going to call the cops and walked to get my phone, and when I looked back, another store owner had come to see if I needed help, and he was gone. I haven't seen him since then, but my job has started to get a lot of hang-ups recently. I do have a taser and I have pepper spray, but I'm 5'2" and 100 pounds, and I don't know if I'll be able to defend myself well enough against a 200-pound dude. I'm properly creeped out, and I don't know what I should do, because I don't really want to be the subject of an episode of Investigation Discovery or something.